going to be talking about it twice.
But before Eric gets into his, does any board members have questions for Patrick?
So
Tee off on it again, or?
Yeah, I can certainly.
Tee off, yeah.
Tee up. So I can tee up MBI. I can tee up MBI by just giving a brief update. And I think similar to how Pat described how a funding strategy began in a prior administration, and then we have to matriculate into a current administration. We're going through the same transition with mass broadband and the last mile project. So, you know, the governor authorized this appropriation very early in his term, but then as we trucked into it, you know, said to A&F, so have we spent it? Are we done? Do the 27,000 homes have broadband? You know, what's going on? And so as the administration sort of started to work closely with MBI on understanding the complexities of delivering last mile service to the 27,000 households in Massachusetts that don't have it. The Office of A&F, Administration of Finance, and Department of Revenue asked us to just pause, to pump the brakes a little bit, so that we can make sure we're on the same page. And that is to say, for instance, you know, we identified maybe 18 communities or, you know, 23 communities which, you know, had passed votes, and we believe we're ready to move forward to procure and start bonding and implementing the project. You know, A&F saying, well, hold on, let's make sure that we're running the same numbers, that we have the same appreciation, that we have the same comfort level. DOR saying, you know, it's our job to make sure that these communities are fiscally prepared to do this. And so what we've done is really broker a new relationship with a new administration of being DOR and A&F and the MBI folks to make sure that as numbers are getting run, as communities are being prepared to embark on going into the last mile journey, which, as we've always said, for many of these communities is the biggest thing they've ever bonded for outside of a fire truck. This is not something we do lightly. And the administration just asked that we pause and work lockstep with each other so that there is always 100% agreement as funds are dispersed that the project moving forward is in the best interest of the community and that all options are being examined, et cetera. So we're doing that. I don't think this pause is a long pause. It's merely a short pause to make sure that we're on the same page. And I'm really excited about how well that is going. And we're going to continue to do that. So it's where we are.
I totally share that excitement. I'm not sure I shared as much of that excitement a week or two ago. But no, I mean, I'm kidding. I'm kidding in that. Well, no, it's because we've had really good meetings. I mean, that's the point. Is that if you asked me where we were a couple of weeks ago, I would have said, I don't know where we are because we're in the middle of these conversations, and frankly, we hadn't had an opportunity to surface all the issues and questions that were out there, and then meet and find out that, quite frankly, I think honestly, almost every question I've heard has been something that somebody of our team or the community of interest that's been involved in broadband has surfaced at one time. All the issues around sustainability and borrowing and that kind of thing are all extraordinarily reasonable, and in fact, actually, it's previewing a little bit of the conversation we want to have today. You know, that we want to kick off with this group. We already did the same one. I apologize, Madam Chair, that we actually are replicating a similar conversation we had the other day. But it's just because I think for this board also simply needs to dig in on the subject as well. But it's been terrific, and I think we're heading in a great direction, and I'm really pleased about it. As a matter of introduction, I will say, some of you may be aware, some of you may not. I'm not really going to talk about an organization, a regional cooperative called Wired West that has been proposing to own and operate a regional network out in Western Massachusetts and towns. But I also know that some of you are aware, or were in meetings in which we were discussing some feedback that we had given to the organization that reflected significant concerns around how they organize themselves and how they organize their business model and operating plans. And so I just wanted to let you know that since the meeting we had on December 10th, NBI board meeting, I should say, in which there's some executive committee members present, NBI and some MassTech personnel, significant MassTech involvement actually, in the corporate team, have been meeting with Wired West and continuing to refine and share information and try to reflect back some feedback that we have to them. I don't have any other additional update on that, and I wasn't intending to dig into it today. I think we have other things to talk about as well that are relevant, but when the time's right, we'll obviously come back with a report. But that's at least the conversations are productive. So just this will be a little bit of update and then straight into the last mile, some of the programs we're doing. One, just to let people get a sense, we still do have a middle mile network. That's broadband 123. And the overall subscriptions of the 1,108 community anchor institutions, which people aren't aware, this is a 1,200 middle mile network that was built with a combination of state and federal funds that has two primary audiences that it connects. One are largely public institutions, whether they're community colleges or elementary schools and high schools and town halls and such, and fire stations, public safety facilities. And then also there is activity among private providers to build off of that middle mile to connect businesses along the routes in the 120 plus towns. And just as a point, I will say that since there was a board approval for this, that there's something called the alternative access point was approved, which is essentially a legal mechanism to enable connections that are going to be privately financed and practically built, connecting off of our middle mile network to connect businesses. That was approved last July. We've had 33 AAP agreements that are in process now that will generate around $60,000 or so in revenue per year. So it's gone well. Overall, one comment I'd make is that when we were meeting with the representative of NTIA, the federal agency that granted our funds for the middle mile network, I would like to improve our benchmarking so we can understand better how we're performing. I'm going to hear Mitch. We actually have some analysis on that I'm not prepared to share today, but one thing I noticed sort of more anecdotally was that when an officer from NCAA was here for the lever ribbon cutting for their network, they commented, we've been interested in knowing how other so-called BTOP grant programs were running and what their level of subscriptions were and how we compared, because we couldn't beat ourselves up if we'd like to have 90% subscription or something like that. And they said that actually we were outperforming most or all of the BTOP programs, grantees for the middle mile networks around the country, that our 46% is well ahead of a range of around, I remember the range of it was something like 15 to 20 or 25% subscriptions for CAIs nationally. And so we're well ahead of that. But as I said, we're starting to dig into report in the future so you get more information on that. This is just a description of the general. As you can see, our adoptions off of our CAIs have plateaued largely, writing a handful of them. And this gives you a sense of who's signed up to that. And as a contact setter, again, for those people who may be new, around last mile, there are 44 communities with Lever Connected now that lack any broadband service in Western Massachusetts, and another 10 communities out of the 78 that have existing cable franchise agreements that have substantial gaps in coverage. So there's plenty of households that are missing. So this defines the universe that we're trying to support in our two programs, broadband extensions, which are the towns in blue that have major gaps in coverage, and the green that are the towns that are unserved. For the broadband extensions program, we're in process right now. Hopefully some of you will remember, we've done an RFQ last summer, identifying potential providers who would be interested in co-investing with the Commonwealth in building out these towns to at least the regional average of 96% coverage, which involves in some communities substantial investment, in some other communities less investment. We got two responses back, one from a company called Matrix and another one from Comcast, who's in fact the incumbent cable and broadband provider in these communities. We've done preliminary evaluations, sent out letters to them for additional information, including proposed coverage maps, so we could actually have an understanding of the actual routes and the premises that would be proposed to be covered. as well as some other due diligence on the business organization, particularly in the case of Matrix, of their ability to provide services over the long term. It's a 20-year agreement in that case. And we've gotten that information back for the most part. We're going to engage with the towns now in getting there into negotiations that again, just to be clear, the qualification to move forward does not, negotiations does not determine an outcome in terms of whether or not they'll do it. Is there any questions?
Is this last mile?
This is the last mile in the towns that have existing cable franchise agreements. So partial.
The blue.
The blue, yes.
Separate, okay.
Yes, the blue towns.
Got it.
Interestingly enough, though, even though the towns that have usually fairly majority, not substantial majorities that are covered, these are very vocal communities about wanting to, so they're, which is a good thing. They're keeping our feet to the fire that we pay as much attention as we need to move this forward.
So it's good that you got 2 bidders. Or is it?
Competition is good. I mean, I think frankly, we didn't know what we were going to get. The reality is, in many of these towns, the proposed extensions are so limited in terms of the number of households that it really challenges the question of how you could sustainably and competitively operate in those communities. And in fact, it's one of the major questions we have. But one of the respondents is, how do we understand what their business strategy is and their ability to service these customers over time, and how it fits with what their growth strategy is. And so it's a concern. Now I'm just going to step through a couple things. The takeaway message I'd offer here, because we are in, as the chair said, a pause right now, is we have very busy colleagues. There are people at MBI who've been doing a lot of good work to prepare ourselves so that when we're able to identify a set of towns and move forward, we will be well prepared to help them move faster than we have at this point. That includes some private companies that are interested in engaging with us in doing the preliminary work around Make Ready, essentially, for the utility poles to gather the data and help us prepare applications for that. It also means a substantially complete draft of an RFP for design and engineering services that could support, actually the way it's drafted, and people didn't know this, it is built around the concept of a fiber to the home network, but it in fact includes substantial interest in evaluating opportunities for hybrid fiber wireless, where that could be more competitive, cost competitive in terms of construction, or given the topography of the towns.
So we're now talking about the green towns.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I apologize.
And this is preliminary work before we bid out the actual
Yes.
network.
Yes.
This will provide information to help us evaluate the bids.
Well, this is actually, this is preliminary work in anticipation of actually getting underway with the work. Although I'm going to talk a little bit about ways in which we could be doing scanning the marketplace more. So this is work that if you handed me 5 towns and said, go forth and build, we would have a firm on hand that could begin the process of make-ready work in those towns, which, as you know, is a major process of being able to connect to the poles and get licenses. And then second, this RFP is, which is potential, and we're not never released it yet, obviously, is to get the services on board to help us think through and refine technology alternatives for the town, and they go straight through the process of actually getting to final bid documents in the towns that we go to bid for construction purposes.
Got it. Preliminary work up to the point of issuing bid documents.
Yes, exactly right, exactly right. And we have, by the way, because the towns are significant partners with us, we have this out, we have an extract of this out to the towns for their substantive feedback on the RFP. We've gotten a number of comments back. That closes on January 29th, but obviously one of the gate is we're trying to make sure we're lined up, because once we go forward with this, we're really in for a penny, in for a pound. We're spending lots of your money, the taxpayers' money, to try to get going with construction, and so we want to make sure we're well organized and aligned before these things go out. We hope to be able to do so sometime in the future. I'm offering this really as a reminder of something that Katie mentioned a moment ago, that there are a number of towns that have moved forward with political votes and very substantial expressions of interest to vote their funds to do deals within their towns. So the takeaway here to me is just that there are a lot of towns, a lot of activity and significant political steps, administrative steps locally, to do town meeting votes, to do debt exclusion votes, in some cases also to reach out to financial advisors and begin the process of documenting and organizing themselves to be able to borrow. And that's really the point of the slide. This also gives you a sense of how those towns are organized relative to the authorization and the votes by the Utah last January around allocating these funds by town. I think as a further...
The money going to towns that are not going ahead, doesn't that money come back and get distributed among the towns going forward?
Well, I mean, I think when we're at the point that we know, potentially, but I mean, it depends on a number of decisions. I mean, one is going to be, are there, since the proposition was largely given to the towns, was you want to do a very good but expensive fiber to the home build, and are you willing to borrow on your behalf to do that? The question, and we're going to get into this in a bit, is there a contrary proposition that should be offered to them to say, is there some either wireless technology, or is there some partial builds, or some other thing you can do that would allow your residents to benefit absent a full build? And then how do we understand that too? And so in other words, it's a major policy conversation to have, right? But if we in fact have towns that aren't currently willing to move forward, what is our perspective? What's the administration's perspective? What's the towns and the legislature's perspective on what should happen? One alternative obviously would be that if the funds were available from the Commonwealth, that we would redistribute them, and there was borrowing costs or help, put aid to towns that are having a more difficult time to borrow given their fiscal position. But there are other alternatives. Okay. So these planning grants, was, I think, as you may hopefully recall, we had brought to the board's attention that we were providing $5,000 planning grants for towns to a variety of activities, everything from legal work to evaluating alternatives to do further homework on a local level on what it would mean to set up an MLP if they were going to set up an MLP. The key thing here is, one, we've gotten substantial interest from a number of towns, 30 in all. As you can see, a number of them are part of Wired West, and sort of singular allocation of money to Wired West and supporting their activities. One thing I'd point out here too, which I think is really critical, is that as we've gotten these planning grant applications in, we've seen a diversity of interest by the towns. Some towns, like Tyringham, for example, that's up there, is trying to seek private investor companies that would invest in builds in their town, might have a long-term license to operate in their town, but would also substantially reduce the borrowing costs of the town, maybe to zero, which raises a lot of questions about how you can do that, or if you can, in fact, legally blend municipal money, looking at Phil distribution, so municipal money with state money and private money. But the point is so that's part of the guidance we need to help give them. But the point is that's what they are thinking of, and are trying to say, can you help us think through, because my goodness, this is an expensive bill. If you look at Alfred, they want to do something that's for itself. Warwick, that's on there, is interested in, they have a legacy wireless system in their town, and they're looking to see, is there a way they could reinvent or reimagine it to provide service in their town. So very interesting learning out of that. Diversity of approaches that people are interested in digging into further, which is going to, everything, so it's like a guided conversation. I'm teeing up something that's coming up in a little bit around sustainability. Furthermore, and this, by the way, is unscientific. It is based upon conversations, feedback, letters, and other things we've gotten from towns. And so it's in flux, but essentially what this map shows you, of those same 44 unserved towns, so the green ones mentioned, what it shows you is just what we understand currently of the diversity of the kind of projects. So the purple ones are towns that we know of as being expressing strong support and confidence in Wired West, as we know it today. The blue ones are towns that many of them have said they might end up wanting to go with Wired West. They're not sure, but they've been openly expressing those interest in looking at different options in terms of operator, but they're looking at fiber builds. The yellow are looking at fiber wireless builds and have been getting some support for feasibility studies. The two orange ones want, frankly, to do independently built and operated builds that would be owned by their towns They have been relatively reluctant, they want our money, of course, but they're relatively reluctant to engage us or Wild West or anyone else, frankly, in support. So again, and actually I should tell you what is it, aquamarine? What kind of colors? The three aquamarine towns are whatever it is, are towns that have existing cable TV franchise licenses with Charter, and Charter with their work with their merger or acquisition with Time Warner is looking now to potentially expand and build out broadband service in those communities. And at least as best we understand it, Hinsdale and Lanesboro have been waiting to see if there would be an advantageous offer that would come their way. And West Stockbridge has done two things. They voted to move forward with Wild West, and simultaneously are looking to see if they get something over the transom from Charter, and would love to do. So real diversity of stuff here.
Does the diversity at some point become dysfunctional?
Are looking at fiber wireless builds and have been getting some support for feasibility studies. The two orange ones want, frankly, to do independently built and operated builds that would be owned by their towns. They have been relatively reluctant, they want our money, of course, but they're relatively reluctant to engage us or Wild West or anyone else, frankly, in support. So again, and actually I should tell you what is it, aquamarine? What kind of colors? The three aquamarine towns are whatever it is, are towns that have existing cable TV franchise licenses with Charter, and Charter with their work with their merger or acquisition with Time Warner is looking now to potentially expand and build out broadband service in those communities. And at least as best we understand it, Hinsdale and Lanesboro have been waiting to see if there would be an advantageous offer that would come their way. And West Stockbridge has done two things. They voted to move forward with Wild West, and simultaneously are looking to see if they get something over the transom from Charter, and would love to do. So real diversity of stuff here.
Does the diversity at some point become dysfunctional?
I think it poses challenges. I think it poses challenges to our staff, not that you have to care about that, because they're being pulled in multiple directions to answer oftentimes excellent and very, very specific and very excellent questions, but that come from very different places that require you to put on very different sort of hats around how you're thinking about these things. I mean, I know it's been true for Elizabeth Copeland, who's here, but Ed Donnelly, who's new to the team, has been challenged on many occasions to say, so, why don't you help me write up something around what perspective we might share around private investments in town bills, right? So challenging, very challenging. So I think our suggestion on that is a couple things. One, that we for example, on wireless, and we wanted to talk about Boylston's wireless pilot a little bit, and I don't need to go into it particularly. You can see here that there's a pilot out there. You approved this investment last summer. There have been bumps in the road. There continue to be bumps in the road, but actually it more or less seems to be working. As was pointed out, our MBI board, they picked the most advantageous geography in their community to do this pilot. So we're going to see, A, what happens when the leaves come in, where it's still, service is still good in the spring, and two, how do they think about challenges to deploying it elsewhere in their town where the topography is not as advantageous. The good news is they actually are getting broadband, FCC definition, quality broadband service in this community using wireless. Otherwise succeeding, they've gotten good adoption from local residents there. So it's a good example of something, but I just want to point out that we've often been treating these wireless projects, whether we're doing feasibility studies or this pilot, as sort of ad hoc responses to local towns bringing us up and saying, hey, this is too expensive, this fiber thing you're talking about. Would you help us think through something else? We probably need to be, we definitely need to be more systematic about how we're engaging that question. But also, by the way, teeing off the fact that the moment we talk about sustainability, and I'm going to turn this to Michael Morgenstern, you're going to see a range of, there's scenarios essentially, or it's modeling, so it's not super precise, but it's good. Modeling of the range of outcomes of towns based on how we view their sustainability from an operating standpoint, and he'll get into that. But when you look at that range, you can see that some of the towns we're working with, like on like Middlefield and Holly, are in fact the ones that they know themselves. They're in fact very challenging places, both to finance as well as to operate a fiber network. And so we need to get organized in that regard. I also think, frankly, regardless of how our work at Conversations with Wired West go, we've been putting thought into how we could help structure intermunicipal agreements and help provide support to towns so that they could reduce the overall burden, administrative burden, procurement's burden, that kind of stuff. You know, just institutional knowledge and learning that they would need over time. And we're already actively putting thought into that. Frankly, that's not even gated by the Wired West Conversations because they could be a part of that conversation as well. There's no reason they couldn't be potentially. But I think that is another way of helping to organize this conversation in a way that gives better guidance, structure, support, capacity building to the towns that are thinking about this. Sorry to look at you constantly, Mitch. It's just that you've been asking most of the questions. For the rest of the board, I apologize. Yeah, questions as well. So I'll move on from this, and I will hand this over to Mr. Morgenstern, who I think many of you know. Be well, introduce yourself to us.
But just before Michael gets started, just to give folks a frame of reference, I think as we were finishing Middle Mile Network a year and a half ago, we were saying that these 44 towns ought to have quote-unquote ubiquitous fiber. And then when we started doing all of these analyses of how expensive it would be for each of these communities, we realized that not every town would be able to come up with a level of funds. So what other solutions were there? And so that's part of what you're hearing today is understanding that there are differences among these communities. They may be geographically clustered, but their ability to bond is different from community to community. Their interest and willingness to spend these kinds of dollars varies from community to community. So we don't want to leave anyone behind. We have, there are 44 communities, but maybe different solutions are appropriate for different communities based on our ability to help them with funding and their ability to come up with a differential and what the topography is and how spread out their population are. It's such a broad array of constraints. So hopefully that's a good segue to Michael.
Good afternoon. I'm Michael Morgenstern. I'm a partner at Wipro Consulting. I've been working with Eric Phil and the MBI team for probably about a year and a half now on a range of last mile related questions. We're going to talk today about sustainability, and this is going to begin a conversation about technologies, but technologies are just one component of many decisions related to sustainability, which we'll come to. I'd just like to put out there that my role and goal here is to provide all of you with better information so that you can set strategy and policy. There's no critique one way or the other in what I'm going to present, and hopefully as little bias as I can possibly bring to the table so that I can just provide facts so that you can decide what you want to do. That's the goal. I'm going to lay out in a couple slides some of the operating challenges to the towns and how under certain sets of assumptions and presumptions there are substantive challenges for some towns and clear sailing or potentially clear sailing for other towns. And I just want to dig in before I even flip the slides on some of the language that I just used. There literally are more than 100 individual operating level decisions that this board, the state, and the eventual operator of a last mile network will have to decide in order to determine whether or not they're going to break even operationally. Some of those decisions are very, I'm sure will be very clear to all of you. What price to charge, which types of products to offer, how do we get the message out to customers. Some of them are very, very, very in the weeds. How much of the driveway distance will we cover with our capital, right? If you live at the top of a mountain 2 miles up a road that you blasted and there's no poles anywhere on that road, is the operator responsible for the $25,000 that it will take to get up to your house or not, right? So some of those are very, very, very in the weeds. That's a real situation, and if you follow the cable company press, every year there's some irate homeowner that puts an article that pick your favorite or your least favorite cable company wants to charge them $25,000 to get to the house, right? It's a real problem. Those are very minutiae. Should it be 200 feet, 300 feet, 450 feet, any amount of feet, right? Conversations. I'm going to try to extract 10,000 feet above those decisions and present to you some scenarios with some overarching assumptions. I don't want you to believe that we haven't gone down to those weeds. So I know that Eric can have those conversations now, and he's got tools in front of him to say, well, what if we do this, and what if we do that, and what if we do this? And this is not the right forum to go through that process. We're happy to engage at that level. So, there's a clicker. I'll just skip so what we've tried to do is model cash flow per town to help you understand what the sustainability of a town is. In order to do that, we had to make assumptions around all 100 of those variables. At a very high level, let me describe a scenario that we're showing you. Let's imagine not being built from scratch. So the town is outsourcing all of the functions that need to be provided to an existing organization, rather than building their own organization. Let's imagine that debt service is not pushed onto that existing organization, onto the operator and or the ISP. So that the debt service for whatever debt the town has to take to do the ubiquitous build is funded by the town rather than by the business. I'm not saying it should be one way or another, I'm just saying let's pick that scenario. Let's imagine that the towns fund whatever internal costs they have, and they're not a lot. They're under, in the $25,000 a year range of running their own MLP so that they can contract with an operator and an ISP. Let's imagine that they're not charging for any administrative load that they have. It's fully outsourced. Let's imagine, so let me talk about pricing just as one scenario here. We've heard from the residents that they want competitively priced products. Right? Everybody wants competitively priced products. How we define competitively priced is really important. If competitively priced is equal to the town next door that has multiple options, right, that's a much lower price than here is a monopoly price that covers costs. The prices that have currently been talked about in Western Massachusetts are based on what Comcast charges next door rather than what a monopolist might have to charge in order to break even. Forget about make monopoly profits, but break even in the town. So for the purpose of this scenario, we've increased the cable company market clearing rates by more or less 30% in order to look at if you charged a monopolist price rather than a competitive price, what would happen? And those prices are in the $64 to $140 range rather than in the $50 to $80 range. Right? It's not a huge, enormous change, potentially, but a change. In this world, town by town, if you built a ubiquitous, or the town built a ubiquitous fiber network that covered every single home or passed every single home in town, enabling every single resident in town to call up and say, I would like service. At 50% penetration, there are 4 towns of the 44 that would generate more than $100K in free cash flow. Now, $100K is a made-up number. It's an easy, round number. But why am I talking about that? Because we have not modeled any unforeseen circumstances. Right? Last year was a really bad winter. In Western Massachusetts, a lot of fiber would have come down. Right? In my world, I would like the operations to be able to cover the cost of those unforeseen eventualities. In order to do that, the operation has to build a reserve account for these unforeseen instances. it seemed to us that 100K a year was a good amount where I could stand here, like I was challenged to by Mitch last year, and say, I'm relatively certain that this could be sustainable and that these towns are not going to be at the next board meeting asking for more money. Right? There's only 4 of them at 50% penetration. There's another 10-ish that at 50% penetration generate less than $25,000 in cash flow. And several of those lose money every year at 50% penetration. It will be really hard for those towns to make this work under any kind of ubiquitous fiber option. Again, I'm talking about outsourced instead of build your own. I'm talking about 30% price increases. If you try to build your own, almost everybody goes underwater, or everybody goes underwater. If you don't increase the price, right, these 10 go up to 30, and those 4 are no longer generating 100K in cash flow. Now, this is at 50% penetration. Should you expect 50% penetration? Leverett's doing much better than 50% penetration. But as a business consultant, I would suggest to you that you should plan for sustainability in maybe not the absolute worst case, but in clearly not the best rosiest case, right? As a consultant, I would suggest to you plan for 40% and hope for 60%. I'm showing you what it looks like at 50% because it's an easy round number. At 75%, everything gets much better, but I should say most of the towns get much better, but not all. At 75%, there are still 6 or 7 towns that don't generate $25,000 a year of free cash, right? Those towns will, I'll say it, those towns will never make this work. You could charge $200 a year. You could charge $200 a month for those towns. It is not going to work. They are going to be at the table having to cover losses in this kind of model. Now, the town could decide we're going to put $300 a month in everybody's tax bill and just offer free service. So there are decisions that the town could make that could cover these losses. But in the type of model that we're talking about, it doesn't.
Yeah, Michael, I just wanted to add, there's no reason why anyone should be able to read any of these towns, and so this is more illustrative of, hey, here are a bunch of towns, look at the distribution. But I do want to point out that if you look down here at the bottom, a number of the towns that have not done anything, meaning some of them have actually told us affirmatively, go away, this is too expensive for us. The town of Hawley organized a letter writing campaign to say to the legislature, give more money because this is too expensive and rich for our blood. I just want to point out that a bunch of those towns are actually clustered down here. They're looking for wireless, that are not doing anything right now. And a funny thing, that's sort of a victory for democracy and local governance, because apparently these towns actually know themselves, I'm not trying to be flippant, but they actually know themselves well, and they know that in fact this is going to be really tough for them. That's what this shows too, but it reinforces for me how this supports the other work we've been doing to try to say, look, we've got to dig in if we're going to follow our directive and Pamela's comments earlier about helping these towns. There's a real challenge here. The towns are aware of the challenge. It's also the good, not all of them, but that's also the good news too, is that in many of these cases, you're pushing on an open door with the towns that if we can find alternatives that will be workable for them, they're begging for that assistance. It's not an antagonistic necessarily.
And these are low-density towns with long distances.
They are
so expensive.
well, the funny part about it, Mitch, is from your perspective, if you took a drive out here, you think the densest town is low density. But yes, they're oftentimes places, they're like Hawley is not only very low density, just to pick on Hawley, but they have 2 main highways, state routes, that run on both sides of a mountain range. And then houses are on different hillsides and down different roads off of those 2 main branches. And I didn't know that until I was on the phone with them, and they're saying, you don't understand how hard it's going to be for us to do it in our town. And, they had me pull out a map, and they talked me through it, and I'm like, I agree with you. This is really tough. So and so it's not just how rural it is and how dispersed the premises are, but also the topography matters enormously.
Well, I just want to say, this speaks to something I think Emily, you brought up at the last meeting, which was, there's got to be a look at what are the 4 different scenarios and what are the 4 different assumptions. And there's not only an assumptions matrix, there's a scenario matrix,
Right.
which makes this incredibly complex, which is what the administration basically went, what about if you have these scenarios, and what if you change these assumptions, and then what happens?
So, thank you both, because that's going to tee up the next slide. Let's talk about the assumptions that this board started this last mile fiber effort with, for good reason. Phil got up, and Phil started receiving letters from the towns over a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, saying, we want ubiquitous fiber. We want it everywhere, we need it, it's part of kind of our future health. Very quickly that was followed by, we recognize it's going to cost a lot of money, and we'll figure out how to get involved in that with you. But that's what we want. We don't want to even look or consider anything else. That's where we all started from. Now that we have much better data about exactly how much money that's going to cost, both on the capital side and potentially on an ongoing operating subsidy side, some towns have walked away, as Eric pointed away, or at least have refused to engage, period. Other towns have requested, help us think through, look at, identify other options. And some towns have said, hey, we're at the top of that chart. That's what we want. Help us get there. Right? So now there's all sorts of clusters, to pick a word that has been used in a lot of different contexts, for us to deal with.
Can I also just say one too? The administration's question was, and let's also make sure as the leading technology state in the country, we have applied all the best technology thinking onto this. So while ubiquitous fiber is what was seen as the best option, the question was, think through, look at, identify other options. And some towns have said, hey, we're at the top of that chart. That's what we want. Help us get there. Right? So now there's all sorts of clusters, to pick a word that has been used in a lot of different contexts, for us to deal with. Can I also just say one too? The administration's question was, and let's also make sure as the leading technology state in the country, we have applied all the best technology thinking onto this. So while ubiquitous fiber is what was seen as the best option, the question was, have we gone out to the brilliant people we know in the ecosystem in Massachusetts and said, what are some options? How would you approach this problem? How would we take different bites of this apple? And I think that's a pretty valid question, given the brain power we have at our fingertips.
I will say, I think that's, of all the questions we could re-examine, that's the one that's least likely to produce a different outcome, because there hasn't been a tremendous amount of change
In the
in
market.
terms of how to provide really high capacity. So it's a reasonable question to ask.
But we got to at least ask it.
So I just very quickly want to bring all of you through some of these real strategic, big picture requests, options, and the decision points that we had previously made, and potentially alternative decision points that you could choose to make or not to make, right? You could say, no, we absolutely want it like that, and that's why we directed Bill and the MBI, or no, we wanted it like that because that's what the towns wanted, but let's be more broader. So the first one, which we've all been talking about, is the technology. Ubiquitous, let me draw the picture for you. Ubiquitous fiber to the home is the most future-proof technology that is available today. And I'm not saying it is future-proof. I am saying of all of the technologies that we know, of all of the R&D that's publicly being done, fiber looks to be able to contain the largest growth in throughput, in bandwidth, in service need, in customer quality of service, bar none, by an order of magnitude. Okay? It is also the most expensive, bar none, by an order of magnitude. So you can serve, and fiber is the only technology, let me rephrase that. Fiber is the only technology that we would consider that you absolutely could reach ubiquity. Meaning at some price point, you can blow a path up that mountain and put poles in, or put conduit in, and reach the guy at the top of the mountain who doesn't want to be anywhere near civilization and get him service. It's very expensive to do, but you could do it. Same thing down in the bottom of the ravine, etc. Fiber can get you everywhere. There are other technologies that in exchange for the cost meaning substantively lower cost. You give up both speed and the option at ubiquity. I'm not suggesting one or the other, I'm saying this is the trade-off that we have in front of us. There are lots of different wireless technologies. They each have their own basket of pros and cons and options and price points and all of that. But just generally, fiber versus wireless, fiber gets you ubiquity, it gets you speed, and it costs you a pretty penny. Wireless, all of the wireless technologies that we would consider are above the FCC definition of broadband, but they're not gigabit, super throughput types of technologies. The concern is they're never going to get there, but they are past where the benchmark is today. And they're much cheaper.
Does scale pose an issue? You couldn't in one town have both, I'm guessing. You'd have to make a decision at the town.
You can have both. You can have a hybrid of them, meaning you can do fiber to certain places and wireless to other places. It actually, the way that those hybrid networks typically work is the cheaper, easier to reach places get the wireless because you can, and the guy that lives on the mountain gets the gold standard because he lives on the mountain, right? Which is a little bit convoluted, backwards in how you think about it, but so I'll leave the technology question, right? Wireless can reach the minimum thresholds. There's a coverage question. Is ubiquity the right answer? Does it have to be ubiquitous? The board asked me this question probably 8 months ago, and I came back and suggested that because of the lack of density of these areas, you don't actually get that much scale benefit in costs for going the next coverage level. So if you cover 90% instead of 80%, or instead of 100%, you pay 82% instead of 90%, not 50%. For most major operators in urban areas, when they stop covering that next percent, it's because their costs skyrocket. 30%, or 3 times, 4 times for the next customer. Here, it's 30% more, 50% more for the next customer. But you can save money by deciding we're only going to cover 90%, or we're only going to cover driveways to 200 feet instead of all the way down the driveway. Pricing, we talked about pricing. Pricing at the cable price of the neighboring town, the competitive cable price of the neighboring towns, almost certainly won't work. Outsourcing, going to existing operations versus building it yourself, as has been proposed by some towns, probably more economical. Debt service, I'll suggest from Wipro's perspective, we are hard-pressed to find scenarios where including debt service in the subscriber price is going to be possible. Meaning that if you want to include the debt service, you're tacking on another $60 a month, and people are not going to pay for it. So I'll leave it at that. And MLP costs, they're generally minimal, but they cause a lot of anxiety in the towns because the towns are not running MLPs. There's a lot of, or they're not all running MLPs. There's a lot of administration. There's a lot of legal context. It's a place that MBI has been supporting and can continue to be supporting. It doesn't move the needle in numbers, but it moves the needle in stress.
And your penetration numbers, are they reflective of your assumption based on price, or is it based on interest by the community? Like, to what extent are people price sensitive on it?
So we have not done any elasticity work. We have not done any primary research in order to answer that, what the price, it's a monopoly market. All of the numbers that we're talking about for price are less than what are currently paid by residents in these communities for substantively inferior services, right? And I can say that the levered price point is higher than what we're talking about, and their penetration is also higher than what we're talking about. They're in general, they're a slightly more affluent community than the average, so it's not a perfect comparable, but it's the closest thing that we have.
The debt service that they can't cover does not include the state's money. It's only the town.
Correct.
Money. So there's a 1/3 subsidy.
Correct.
Even then,
yes,
it's not affordable.
Correct. I'll give it to you another way. if there was no debt service, I mean, these numbers where I told you there's only 4 towns at 50% penetration that generate more than $100,000 of cash, that doesn't include any debt service in it, right? So that $100,000 might get plowed back into their debt service or paid to the town in order to redistribute in their budget. But for most towns, you know, the $25,000 to $100,000 worth of cash won't cover the debt service.
It does just prove the point that this is not an economic, the private sector would never have done this.
That's why they have.
They
wouldn't.
That's why we're on
They
Senate.
wouldn't, and they're not going to. They're not going to.
Right.
Okay, in the
That's why
interest
we
of
have
time,
this tremendous opportunity.
in the interest of time,
We could just have the state funded 100%. Make this task so much easier. Katie's task would be harder, but.
I won't run through the slide, I'll just point out that for every one of these decisions, there are good reasons, one way that you guys decided in the past, and the other way. And they're all policy level decisions, not necessarily kind of business finance driven decisions. And again, there are a lot more questions that need to be answered at this very, very town by town, granular level, technology by technology, need by need, cost by cost. Some towns want to go alone, some towns want at least tell us what the option is for fiber, so we can decide, or for wireless, so we can decide between the two options, and there are still towns that say we have no idea. So I'll take questions or not. Bill?
I just want to add that I don't want to go beyond my place here, but what I heard the governor say the other day, one thing I heard him say is the sine qua non of going forward in this administration. This program is going to be a very rigorous hold.
So we can decide, or for wireless, so we can decide between the two options, and there are still towns that say we have no idea. So I'll take questions or not. Bill?
I just want to add that I don't want to go beyond my place here, but what I heard the governor say the other day, one thing I heard him say is the sine qua non of going forward in this administration. This program is going to be a very rigorous, open discussion of all these issues. And to the extent that we feel we have been constrained to date not to raise some of these issues, which I think we have, that's open. And I, for one, I think it's going to be a very refreshing discussion. But it is coming, and it's going to be a different discussion than we've been having for the last year and a half.
You know, I think I would agree with that point, and it's funny actually, without teeing it up, it actually echoes something I was going to try to close my comments with here, is when you look at this slide, regardless of whether you think it's acceptable to, where'd you go? Well, there you are. Moving around like that. Whether it's 50% adoption, whether it's a number of elements that, as Michael went through, you can alter the operations, the business plan, the pricing. There are a lot of decisions you can make, and we have a practical example of that even in Leverett, where they worked through very, very diligently, looking at examples of what the Chapter 164, the MLP law, allowed you to do, what it required you to do in terms of capital depreciation reserves, what it allowed you to do in terms of having a cash flow, to have reserve accounts for free cash, which already is allowable under the law. It's also how they determine how they would allocate MLP charges and allow it to essentially float based on need, and got public buy-in that their pricing per year could actually change from $75 to $85. They'd be transparent about the reason, including like they might be buying more bandwidth, so if they have to pay more money, people are using more bandwidth, or whatever the issue is. And as it turns out, actually, Leverett reduced their costs. But the point I'm making when you look at here is, in addition to wanting to robustly make sure we can present and think through technology alternatives, what are the range of possible outcomes and goods that the towns can obtain by looking deeper into technology, looking at what the capacity and the pros and cons, as you described, of wireless, what their sort of forecast is. That's one element. Two, we clearly have towns, and again, as I said, most of these towns already know it already, that we can organize more systematically around looking for ways in which they can meet their needs, but possibly with less than 100% coverage, with alternative technologies, meaning wireless, or in fact, a composite of fiber and wireless, depending on what the topography and needs of the towns are. At the upper level, at the upper boundary, one of the things that if we can do, it'd be great to do, I think there's general assent, is if there are towns that are relatively unproblematic or darn unproblematic around the capacity to borrow as well as also to operate sustainably, that we show some movement, help the towns. I think there's general, if we can come to agreement on that, I think there's general agreement that we'd like to get moving and helping towns as soon as we can. And then frankly, to the point of what Michael was describing, and what I was mentioning are the different levers that we need to dig into. This broad middle here, this broad middle, they exist in this world in which we're going to have to really dig in, probably on a town-by-town basis with the towns, to help them think through what their options are. On borrowing, we think there's some potential options they might have that can reduce overall borrowing costs through a USDA program. We're trying to run that into the ground. But in terms of how they set up their MLPs, what we can do around joint procurements or administrative, evening out the administrative burden across towns, the things we can do, that's where the conversation's going. And so for our work, we're going to be digging into that over the next, it's a preview of coming attractions, but it's something we're going to be interested in your engagement on.
So I think we have time for about one or two quick questions before we get to our last agenda item.
Just out of curiosity, where does this leave us? I understand that we're in a bit of a pause in terms of letting the administration, also look into this and get aligned with them. All these questions kind of that Michael have presented today, is this for us to decide? Is it going to be for us to decide with some alignment from the administration? Will we be taking direction from the administration? And is the plan for us to kind of go forward and see what we think and then figure out how it dovetails? I'm just...
When it comes to the administration, I'll have Madam Chair.
So right now, it is a joint process. Right now, we're aggressively scheduling meetings. So the decision points, reviewing anything that we're discussing together. Because I don't want conversations to happen in isolation of each other. It just doesn't make any sense. It's inefficient. And in a way, A&F and DOR are playing catch up. They've been, transition, budgets, all these different departments, all these different demands. It's sort of like they just came to the point where MBI was sort of next on the list. It was queued up, but it was, 10, 11 months into their first year. So while it would have been great if, last January we were like, hey, let's all do this together, it's just not a reality or possible. So it's going to be together, and every decision at this point we come to is going to be a shared decision, and not one making a decision for the other, but literally let's find consensus, let's go. So like consensus, green light, yeah.
So I assume one constraint is the amount of money we have to work with.
Yeah, and that's something that the administration certainly, we don't want there to be winners and losers at the end of the day. So we're going to we want to go back and look at, is that the right amount of money? If you mix up different technologies, is there a different number?
Okay, so that is not a fixed constraint, the 50 million or whatever it was. I mean, if we could, if we had a better idea, go back and adjust that.
Mitch, what I would say is, as I was inviting him a moment ago, is with the administration, but also within NSTEC and MBI, we have a lot of things we need to dig in to put, and this echoes what Phil said. Facts to put on the table for people to chew over, and so it's from what we've heard, what you've been saying, what we've heard, the answer is probably yes to that question, but it's premature to say that yes until we really dig into understanding what that path would be for these towns, and what's an actual implementation strategy.
Well, it's just a question of trying to get the variables to narrow. You have to set a constraint, and then start looking at the trade-offs. So I'm just trying to find where's the spot for a constraint.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I assume a town needs to know a constraint, and then they can decide coverage, technology, tax
Well, as we
rate.
get this information out, though, I anticipate this, and we've already talked about the administration, and one of the things that we're going to hear is, and I hate to say this, but if you had X amount, I won't say the number, a number, there's no number on it. If you had X amount of money more, would this be able to substantially improve the ability of this group of towns that you're presenting as being challenged? So we've been asked that question before. Do you have that information already? The answer is no, because we haven't been that granular yet. And we need to get there for a variety of reasons that Phil described.
Plus, I mean, we are working with people like the Senate President that are pretty well positioned to be able to make those determinations better than we. So, and we pass on the information.
Given if you start the assumption, the analysis, we have a fixed amount of money, what's the best way for us to allocate it out there? And maybe there are 4 or 5 different ways, probably 100 ways. But what are the 4 major ways of allocating the money, and what does that then mean for the towns? You get a chance to see kind of what the impacts are.
Sure.
And if you can minimize certain very severe negative impacts on certain towns, you can go back and add money or reallocate.
Absolutely.
Right?
All right, I'm gonna put the brakes on the conversation, only because we've gotta get to the last agenda item before we have next hard stop.
But there will be future opportunities to continue this conversation with this group.
Yes, so thank you, Eric.